and I went to see the latest installment of Mission Impossible. And I won't say anything about that movie, so there's no reason for a spoiler alert or anything. What was interesting, though, was one of the clips, the ads for the new James Bond movie that's coming out, of course, in several months. Plug it months ahead of time. There was this just brief scene in which I think it was a woman who was saying to the Bond character, "Do you really want to keep doing this?" To which Bond says, "I never really gave it a thought." And I thought that was a fascinating thing, a fascinating quote to capture what we often do in life. That is, that we move along in life, perhaps at a pace that is startling, a pace that we feel like we can barely control, and that life somehow lives itself for us, and we're sort of riding along, rather than our stepping back and considering, what is the path that I want to take? What is the direction that I will go? How do I choose to live? I think our passages today can give us some insight into this whole idea of reflective living, on knowing where we need to turn as a starting point for realizing how we should live in our life in the world. I turn first really to some thoughts on the gospel passage. This strange sort of series of teachings. You know, we've been talking about Jesus as the bread of life and eating the bread of life. And Jesus, again, turns to this theme and really sort of baldly sort of states that you need to eat me, eat my flesh. And it's a rather interesting thing to consider, because it's in John's gospel that we really don't get a full-fledged expression of the Lord's Supper. We get that in what are known as the synoptic gospels. That's the first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that word synoptic means they have the same or a similar viewpoint. Well, John's very different. Robin and I have talked about that before, I think, on many occasions. And John does a different take on that whole idea. It was probably written decades after the other Gospels, actually. And John seems to be trying to get us to think about what it means to be fully immersed in the Spirit of Christ as a basis for how we live in the world. What does it mean for that to happen for us? It's a fascinating thing to consider the spiritual sort of atmosphere that was going on at the time. And William Barclay, the beloved Scottish biblical scholar who wrote commentaries on all the books of the New Testament, offers some of these pictures. He was talking about the fact that there were the Greek mystery religious traditions that had the teachings that, you know, the goal is to have communion with and to have identity with, sort of to lose your own identity in the identity of some god of the Greek pantheon. He quotes the mysteries of Mithra, where the initiates would pray something like, "Abide with my soul, leave me not, that I may be initiated, and that thy Holy Spirit might dwell within me." And another one, "Come to me, Lord Hermes, as babes to mothers' wombs." And another to the mysteries of Isis. "Oh, as truly as Isis lives, so shall your followers live. As truly as Osiris is dead, his followers shall die no more." All of this dynamic was going on from these other religious traditions. And so it's interesting for us to understand that when people heard Jesus talking about, "Eat my body, drink my blood," they were really not going to take it very literally. They were going to get it, that what he was inviting was for people to be ones whose hearts were fully embedded in the Spirit that he taught us to live by, the ethic that he taught us to follow, the love path that he asked us to journey along. This whole sense of immersion and embeddedness in that. Keep offering us that word. That's what we want to hear. Thank you. So this idea of being embedded in the Spirit is really a very interesting thing for us to consider. Really, and the pace is the thing that grabs me in our lives. Do we have time to do it? I've mentioned this before. Do we have time to be faithfully stepping back? I'm going to be talking about one conversation I had and one that I overheard this morning, and not give any credit and identify no names to incriminate anyone, although it's nothing really to be incriminated by, but I heard someone say today, characterize life, busy, busy, everyone's on the move. I'm just passing by, and I overhear that line. I mean, do we understand that life is going at such a pace sometimes that we really are not rooted in that which we really truly want to be rooted in? We're here for some reason. And I think it's really understandable that we've got things constantly going through our minds. I mean, think about waking up each day. If you've ever done this, just actually taken the effort to do so. You realize that once you get the grogginess out of your brain at the beginning of the day, that you don't have to say to your mind, okay, mind, turn on. That's not the way it functions. There's simply things that are going through there all the time. There are images that are going through the brain. There are thoughts. There are feelings. There are ideas. There are memories of what happened. There are hopes for the future. There are illusions. There are delusions. There is great insight once in a while that's constantly going through. It's like all the time. People oftentimes, whenever you ask them if they're interested in doing meditation, or if they consider doing meditation and actually start doing so, they try to sit quietly, and boom, the mind is going at fast pace. And it's almost, if it wasn't so disturbing and anxiety-provoking, it would be almost entertaining, because there's constantly stuff going through, if you're able to calm yourself enough even to start watching. And so it's a fascinating thing to ask the question, if that is the case, what do we do with all that? How do we keep that from controlling our lives versus observing well and then choosing our relationship to those things? Labeling them and letting them go on. The stuff that you don't really need to have happen. The disturbing stuff that's distracting, let it go on. The stuff that you really need being offering attention to, focusing on that. And productively, and I should say meaningfully, dealing with all that stuff that's going through our brains. It's a really important thing for us to consider today. We have so many people in our tradition, though, Christianity, that can help us. Brother Lawrence is one of the most popular ones. Here was this 17th century monk, no education, couldn't read. But there would be noble men and women that would go to him to talk to him about deep spiritual things. He was the one that would speak about practicing the presence of God each day. And what he meant by that was to constantly feel the presence of God's gaze on our lives. And God's walking with us through each day. Never a moment when we're alone. Ever. You may be alone physically, but that's irrelevant to this. Constantly the presence of the Spirit there. We forget that so much of the time. What does it mean for us to so order our lives, so order that inner world that's constantly moving, so that we have the sense and have the reality of the presence of God confirmed time after time? In Christianity, and lots of religious traditions talk about this. In Christianity, we talk about this in terms of centering prayer. How do we quiet things down and then make a choice about what is going to be on the guiding thought on our mind? In centering prayer, you can choose a word, perhaps, that's going to be the guiding idea. And think about the word love, for example. And you'll make a distraction going through your mind as you're quietly sitting, perhaps for 15, 20 minutes, simply trying to concentrate on that word. And it's not a problem that thoughts come through. You deal with them, and you return to love. Or, as the thought's going through, how does love relate to that thought? Or how can it? What does it mean for us to deal with that inner world in a regular way so that we are shaping it and allowing the Spirit to shape what's going on in there? I think about Lynn Schmidt repeatedly, one of our former members, now living, I believe, in Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee, who would teach her daughters each day to awaken, and she would say to them, say to yourself, I have a choice to make today. Today I choose joy. What does it mean for us to get a sense of what's going on in our world, our inner world, and choose the direction for that? Because it matters. The state of that inner world has to do with what happens outwardly. So eating Christ, drinking Christ really has to do with bringing the Spirit of Christ the love of Christ into our inner world so that then something happens outwardly. And let's move to that, which is really what I see our Old Testament passage having to do with. We have this prayer of Solomon that takes place with the dedication of the temple. Remember, Solomon's the one who's permitted to build the temple. His father David wanted to do so, but God said to him, "You were a man of war. You are not going to be the one who appropriately built my temple." His son Solomon was the one who was given this task. And it's interesting to think about that whole word, the word wisdom. In the Hebrew text, it's the word chachma, which has to do with being skillful. A wisdom that has to do with skill. And it's interesting to consider people who have a skill in this or that area. Have any of you been to the place called Dollywood in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee? Anyone? All right, 2 of you, 3 of you, 4, all right, very good. Dolly Parton set this up. What? And you might say association with Dolly Parton, you might chuckle, all right, if you're not a country music fan, that's country music stuff, or it's Dolly, and, it's all sort of flimsy and thin. It is not at all. I mean, it's a place that mixes together marvelous gardens with performance venues, with an award-winning educational center, and then these places where all these artisans are working, where you have glass blowers working. I think there's woodworkers. I think there's metal workers that are going on. And what an interesting place that is to see various different people's crafts in the process of being shaped, or the consequences of them competently doing so with the performers and the gardens, for example. Seeing skill, a mastery at work is such an impressive thing. And what does it mean for us, therefore, to consider that? How to live a wise life. Solomon, the one who was the wise king. Wisdom's a word that comes from an old German word that means a judicial sentence that becomes a precedent. So, some wise conclusion to a legal case becomes the basis for understanding the future, because it has wisdom to give to the future. What does it mean for us to want to have that? And wisdom has to do with acumen, so sharpness, keen-mindedness, and the opposite. Consider the opposite of it. Obtuse, dull. The word obtuse has to do with beaten. That is, beaten down so much that you're dull, like a blade. And I think of Lincoln talking about the most important part of chopping wood was sharpening the edge. He spent twice as much time sharpening his axe as he did actually cutting the wood. I think of those wise craftspeople who always say, measure what?
Twice.
Cut?
Once.
There you go, all right? I mean, I did that most of the way through my deck project. At the beginning of this week, I had a little slip. And my spindles I was making for the deck, 5 of them turned out to be 3 inches short because I wasn't measuring twice or thrice. To me, it has to be 4 times most of the time. Thankfully, I had just enough wood to compensate for my error. I think of cooking shows and watching Martha and Lydia and the late Julia and Jacques, and seeing them working with those knives and cutting the vegetables and all other things. You're seeing people who understand and skillfully work with material even as they sharpen the tools for working with the material. So it's this really vivid image, this idea of wisdom and sharpness, that somehow if we order our lives in the right way, we can take the right path. Now, Solomon we know is the sort of legendary wise person, but he wasn't perfect. He was the one that had this policy known as corvée labor, in which you take the labor of your people as tax. And that was the way he built many of his impressive buildings. Well, ultimately, that was what led to the division of the empire after his monarchy. We've talked about that before. But it's a really interesting thing that at his best moments, he was pretty impressive. And today, the thing I want to emphasize is the last part of the prayer. Because Solomon asks, first of all, please be attentive to the prayer of your servant. Then he's talking about himself. Then he's saying, be attentive to the prayer of your people. But what's the third group of people that he asks that God be attentive to their prayer? Do you remember?
Foreigners.
Foreigners. In this day in which we're really trying to work out what that means. Across the world, we don't know what to do with this thing about immigrants. This whole movement of immigration, the dynamics of world politics, of economy that are going on, that make our borders these really strange places in which the desperate are knocking on the door of various different borders, and it's putting stress on the societies that are wealthy, the strangers. And lest we just sort of give in to sort of the popular way of responding to that and protecting our own and what we have and so forth, think of strangers from a very basic level. The theologian Paul Tillich would talk about the fact that we're all strangers to one another. Not any of us fully know the other. We barely know ourselves. That whole mindfulness thing I was inviting you to, the inner work, we're doing that because we don't know ourselves. And we need to know what's going on there. Well, think about one another. I've had conversations with parents who have talked about being surprised at who their children became, or being surprised at how different they were from themselves. Strangers. Then the pool is just like a pebble in the pool. Take the relationships outward, and the strangeness continues. But with each level, what we need to remember as faithful followers of Christ is that each person has dignity. Whether you know them or not, God doesn't give a hoot whether you know them. God wants us to respect one another, to respect all people, the strangers, so that immigrant becomes this person who's a mother, a father, a desperate person. I saw an article about an electrical engineer passing through Serbia to Hungary, trying to get to a place where he could practice his skills for the benefit of others. I saw a figure that if we lost all of the illegal immigrants in the United States, it would have a $1.5 trillion impact on our economy. This is a complicated picture here. A fascinating, difficult picture. Can we muster the wisdom, and can our leaders muster the wisdom to deal with who we call the foreigners? We're all foreigners to one another to some degree. We're all people of dignity. So it's an interesting thing to turn to the story of that we've been hearing this week of Jimmy Carter, as he's clearly going to be facing his last period of life. And what was interesting was the obscure, in his interview this past week, as he was talking about the treatment he was undergoing, this obscure reference to the guinea worm that he made. He made a statement that I hope to survive to see the death of the last guinea worm. No one basically knew what he was talking about except people associated with his center and perhaps scientists related to it. But the guinea worm is this microscopic organism that gets into water, that can grow to 3 feet in length, that can get into a person from contaminated water and can get under the skin and can burst the skin and give you tremendous pain, almost paralyzing pain. And what was interesting yesterday to listen to the National Public Radio talk about the Carter Center's involvement in Africa, going to 26,000 villages in Africa, starting in 1986, because Carter discovered from a UN official that no one was working on this. They go into those 26,000 villages, they give all of these, dig all of these wells, they give all this water purification material. When they began, there were 3.5 million people afflicted by the guinea worm. When they completed their work, and this year, there have been 126 cases. That's amazing. What does it mean to be so rooted in the Spirit of Christ that out of that inner clarity, we make a commitment to do little things, a microscopic creature, to deal with the small things that have profound impact on the world? It's amazing stuff. What does it mean for reorienting our minds to that which is strange or different than us? To understand and to become makers of peace and solvers of puzzles rather than creators of problems. What does it mean to think about our call to be the gracious, active presence of Christ in the world today? I think that's what the passages call us to be about. Let's get our inner world in order, that we might, in small, incremental, but powerful steps, change the world without. Let's take a moment to pray. This day, mighty God, we ask that you would compel us, but more than that, persuade us that our wills may freely turn to you, that when we hit the limits of our imagination, we would know the direction that we must go in, that is to you, through your Son, Jesus, to be rooted in the values of recreativity, of healing, in order to impact the world, an ever-growing world, an ever-broken world, but to impact that world by the power of your creative love. May we be that sort of people this week. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen.